Alex Newman of the New American. Alex, you've got the floor for the next 22 minutes we've got left in this hour. I appreciate you coming on short notice, but I saw your article dealing with the redistribution of wealth, and I know people understand the Fed's a fraud, but your article, speaking to the experts doing the research, really in just 10 pages or so, condenses it down in easy-to-understand language, and it's so important to get this information out to everybody, because this is how this illegitimate New World Order gets all its power, as you know. So walk us through this.
Well, thanks for having me on, Alex. And yeah, basically, it's what you said. It's this huge scheme. And so what I did with this story, I started by looking at basically real estate and the stock market, and I started noticing that the Fed was, printing trillions of dollars and giving it to their friends at the banks. And, a lot of this is well known now from testimony in Congress and stuff, where he was admitting that they printed $500 billion and gave it to foreign central banks so they could give it to their banks. And so what they did was they saw the banking sector was collapsing, and so they printed tons and tons of money and just handed it out to their friends. And then when you start looking even deeper, you see that this gets even worse than what's on the surface already terrible. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York, you can even check this out on their website, actually, at newyorkfed.org. They have information about these front companies that they created. It was Maiden Lane 1, Maiden Lane 2, and Maiden Lane 3. They're LLCs, limited liability companies, incorporated in Delaware. And essentially what the Fed did was just printed money out of thin air, gave it to these companies, and the companies started buying up garbage from companies like AIG, companies like Bear Stearns. And what this did was it just basically put tons of money in the pockets of banks like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan. So imagine investors. The way I came across this story in the first place was a guy called William Pitts. He's a developer and an investor down in Florida. And he started telling people that he had sold some of his stock in the big financial companies, and he had bought short positions on Citibank and Bank of America and these kinds of things. And he even bought some exchange-traded funds that would go up in value as real estate and the financials went down. And so instead of making a fortune, which would have been the natural consequence of properly reading the market, real estate was a huge mess, the banks were a mess. What happened was the Fed started bailing them all out without any authorization from Congress. Of course, the Constitution says Congress should allocate money. But what happened here was the Fed just started bailing out all these companies. And so investors who properly read the market, who saw what was going on, lost their money, and insiders made a fortune because they knew what was going to happen. They knew what actions the Fed was going to take. And then from there, you can look at basically any segment of the economy, and you see that it's being rigged by the Federal Reserve. For example, the precious metals market. A lot has come out in the last few months here, but even before that, we had Alan Greenspan. In 1998, he went to Congress and he told them that as the price of gold rises, the central bank is going to lease out increasing quantities. So basically, if the price of gold goes up, the Fed is going to keep it down by leasing out some of its gold supplies. And so that's good for the Fed. It's good for the banks, but it's obviously bad for the people. It's bad for the government. And then more recently, too, we had a Commodities Futures Trade Commission meeting, and there was some really explosive testimony there. I was a little bit upset that it didn't get more media coverage, but you had, for example, Andrew Maguire. He was a metals trader in London, and he came out and flat out said that the Federal Reserve was, through its agents, JP Morgan and so forth, stopping the rise in the prices of gold and silver, and that it was being insulated from any potential losses by the Fed and the taxpayer. So, again, we have this manipulation in the precious metals market. You have manipulations in stocks and bonds. And the ways that they're bailing out the banks, it's too many to count. You have the Fed giving the banks money, and then the commercial banks put the money back with the Fed, and the Fed pays them interest. You have the Fed with interest rates extremely low right now, obviously artificially. And then what the commercial banks are doing, they're taking this Fed money at virtually no interest, and they're buying U.S. Treasury securities with it. So the taxpayer is basically funding profits for the banks, because a Treasury security they have much higher interest rates than what the Fed is charging right now for commercial banks to borrow from them. So basically, they're doing nothing, and they're getting a huge bailout from the Fed. It's not even a bailout. It's just a theft. They're just taking money from taxpayers by doing nothing, by taking money from the Fed at almost no interest and just loaning it to the U.S. government and making a fortune off of the backs of people who pay their taxes. So this is just, in so many ways, the Fed is ripping off the American people. And then when you get past the market manipulations, the manipulation of stocks, bonds, gold, silver, all of these things, then you have the biggest manipulation of all manipulations. It's the manipulation of the money supply. With their control of the money supply, aside from being a debt trap, which I'll get to in just a moment, it creates the boom and bust cycle, and it allows their friends to get rich while Americans, get in debt. And, well, it's a permanent debt. It's a debt that we can't ever pay back, because when the Fed loans out money, you're stuck in a situation where you have to pay interest on that money, but they never created the interest. So I'm sure a lot of your listeners are familiar with this already, but I mean, you can't emphasize it enough. It's not that if there was good people running the Fed, this would all be okay. It's literally a trap. It's a Ponzi scheme, and it cannot continue indefinitely. I mean, it'll work as long as they can keep finding new people to keep borrowing new money into the system so that people can pay off the old debt with the old interest. But when people stop borrowing the money, then you get a collapse. And, all this printing of money, it's bankrupting Americans through inflation. When we originally got the Fed, the dollar was worth something like, our dollar today is worth something like 5 cents compared to the dollar when we originally got the Federal Reserve. And that's just all a theft against the American people. And the money goes to finance big government, it goes to finance the wars, and it goes to finance this incredible wealth that the elite class has amassed by manipulating the system to its advantage. It's, it kind of leaves you at a loss for words. In my opinion, this is one of the single biggest issues that we need to solve if we hope to get America back on the right track, because as long as we don't have honest money, we're never going to have a proper economy, and you can never say we have a free market, because they're manipulating the market for money. That's the most crucial, basic thing in an economy, and it's a central planning commission. We know that central planning doesn't work, but that's exactly what these guys at the Federal Reserve Board are doing. They just arbitrarily pick an interest rate, whatever they think is. They say that they're doing it in our interest. You can think whatever you want about that central planning. Yeah, so I mean, we're literally in a really bad situation. Unfortunately, the rest of the world is in this situation with us. Almost every country has a central bank that operates similarly to ours. And, some people think that the Federal Reserve is a government agency. It's really important for people to understand that it's not. What it is a banking cartel. And I think cartel really is the best word to describe it, because the way it's structured, you have 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, and each one is owned by its member banks. They're basically shareholders. And the Federal Reserve admits to this. Recently, when they were sued by Bloomberg, a Freedom of Information request, trying to figure out where that $2 trillion in emergency lending went, the Fed admitted, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York filed a supplementary brief saying, hey, we're a private institution. We're owned by private shareholders. Our board members are appointed by our private shareholders. You can't force us to disclose anything. We're not subject to the Freedom of Information Act because we're not part of the government. And so far, the courts have not bought that argument. So Bloomberg is making some progress on the lawsuit. They won on appeal as well. The Fed appealed the decision, and Bloomberg was successful on the appeal. But the Fed is still refusing to hand over the documents. So that's one component of it's estimated now at $27 trillion in potential liabilities that the Fed has put us on the line for. And to put that number in perspective, the U.S. economy, our gross domestic product, is in the neighborhood of $13 trillion. So, I mean, this figure is so startling. That comes out to about $75,000 per person in the United States, including children. So if you can imagine yourself paying back $75,000 for the actions of the Fed, which, they haven't even benefited you. If anything, they're helping to bankrupt you, and now you're on the line to pay for it all. So, I mean, this should really outrage people. I think, like Ron Paul, it's one of the most important issues for us to get our country back on track is to solve this Federal Reserve mess. We need to get rid of it, and we need to institute sound money, without a question. Gold and silver, in my opinion, are a good way to go, and we can have a debate about where to go with money. I was listening to your interview the other day with, is his name Peter Joseph from Zeitgeist?
Yeah, that was years ago.
Oh, was it? Yeah. And, I mean, I don't think that we need to get rid of money. His argument about if we get, the scarcity thing.
His argument is to have a global computer that decides everything, and it is absolute dehumanization. But it's always packaged. That's what the collectivists always do, is they package things as total liberation, but what it brings is total enslavement. That's why you have the New York Times doing positive, glowing reviews of him, while separately saying, I'm violent and need to be arrested. The system gives that their seal of approval and goes into convulsions of fear dealing with me.